Hello, and welcome to episode number 5 of the Crushing Classical podcast, Redefining Thriving Classical Music Careers. I'm your host, Tracy Friedlander. Today, I'm interviewing Jason Heath, who is a professional bass player and a well-known podcaster in the bass community. And I have all kinds of questions to ask him about podcasting and how it impacted your career. Jason, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Tracy, thank you for being here. And we've known each other for years. When did we first meet?
In Civic Orchestra, I believe, the training orchestra in Chicago. Or maybe was it at DePaul? Did you go to DePaul?
I was kind of hanging around DePaul. I never went there, but I know in Civic, that was like late 90s. We're talking 2000. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I'm just super excited for this show. I'm thrilled to be one of the early guests. So thank you for asking me. And I love the concept of this podcast, and I'm looking forward to checking out all these episodes. So thank you so much for asking me. I'm honored to be on the show.
Thank you. Well, I've been checking out your podcast, and I'm like, wow, these are some, big shoes to fill. Not that I'm trying to I'm following in your footsteps, essentially. And you've been doing hundreds and hundreds of podcasts for years, and quite frankly, I'm comparing myself to you and going, oh my gosh, I'm so far to come to sound as professional and amazing as you do on yours. So,
like I was saying to you before, just anybody who's listening, if you want to hear a contrast, go back and listen to episode number 1 of my podcast, Contrabass Conversations, and it's awkwardness in every way imaginable.
Well, I hear you, because that's how I feel right now. But why did you decide to start a podcast?
Well, I got really into podcasts in, I want to say 2005, which is kind of around when podcasts started to happen. I think the first podcast was probably, I think most people say it's Adam Curry, the MTV VJ, if any of you remember that era. He started a podcast called The Daily Source Code, and I think that was 2004 that came out. So I got my first iPod in 2005, and I plugged it into my computer, and I saw there was this section on the iTunes store that said podcasts, and I said, what are those? And I got really hooked by Leo Laporte's This Week in Tech, which is still going on. I love that podcast. It's a super geeky podcast, but so much fun. I actually went and saw a live taping last year here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'd been blogging for about a year. And I was enjoying blogging. I was having a good time blogging, but I just got the bug to make a podcast like really early on. And so 2005, 2006, I really started to plan it, and I just thought about it, decided to do it. And I finally launched January 1st, 2007. And it's called Contrabass Conversations, all about the world of the bass. And that's kind of the story behind it.
Great. And so you just went ahead and started interviewing bass players. Did you have a specific kind of bass player in mind, or just any and all bass players? Were you going for the famous ones or colleagues?
Well, it was super duper scary at first. The first 3 episodes are just me talking into a microphone about how I would like to interview people. So I still hadn't set up an interview with anybody. And finally, I interviewed a friend of mine, one of the bass players in the Lyric Opera of Chicago, Andy Anderson. And I think so many people who podcast, that's how you start. You start by interviewing friends, which is a great way to go because it's very comfortable. And I wanted to take it as far as I could. I had visions of talking to all these famous bass players, and eventually that's what happened. But in the beginning, it was definitely a leap of faith. And also, like 2007, doing a podcast, I got a lot of, who are you? What is a podcast, and why should I be on this podcast you're talking about? So it wasn't until I got what you call social proof, with actually getting a few bigger name guests in the can and getting them out, that people realized, oh, you're the guy who interviewed Ed Barker of the Boston Symphony. Of course I'll be on your podcast. But that took a few months to get to that point. So within maybe 3-4 months, it was pretty easy to get just about anybody I wanted on the podcast, guest wise.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really awesome. So how has it impacted your career?
Well, it's impacted in ways I never imagined. And for me, it's all tied in. The blog and the podcast are kind of interwoven. It's kind of one and the same. And it really, all that started just as an exercise in frustration / boredom / just goofing around, I guess. I was a full-time freelancer. That's what I did. Played the Freeway Philharmonic kind of scene that so many people who are listening probably are familiar with. I held 3 orchestra contracts, played at another 6 or 7 orchestras part-time. I taught part-time at a university. I had another probably 30 students outside of that university, and 7 days a week, just kind of doing that. And I was just seeing my life stretch out in front of me and kind of more of the same. And my wife at the time was also freelancing. She was a harpist and decided to go back to medical school. And talking with her about that and her decision, it just kind of got my brain going. And I started thinking, well, do I like what I'm doing? And the short answer was no, not really. And so I decided to actually go back to school and get another degree. But when I decided to do that, I didn't stop practicing the bass, but my practice time went way down, and I was kind of finding different ways to fill that time. And I just started blogging just kind of as a lark, and it started to grow and connect with people. And the blog really started to get traction in the classical music world probably 2006, I want to say, or maybe early 2007, I was on lists of top 20 classical music sites, for the internet. I really got a lot of traction outside of the bass world, even though it's called Jason Heath's Double Bass Blog. It's kind of silly that it was being read by all these other people, but I was not just writing about the bass. I was writing about kind of what you're talking about on the podcast. So I totally love the finding different directions in music, frustration with the music conservatory system, the job prospects for musicians, what we're told, what the reality is, what the future looks like. So that was kind of a lot of what I was writing about and that people are identifying with. But the podcast became a little bit more, it was more bass centric. And for me, my podcast was a lot more of kind of like a positive contribution to the world. I love writing. I have a lot of fun writing, but I was sort of feeling my writing was just getting kind of whiny without I was just kind of, people would write in, they'd be like, man, I'm really bummed out about reading all this. It just seems so hopeless. And so in a way, I think the podcast was a desire. I'm a positive guy in general, and I think the podcast was kind of a way for me to actually give something to the music community and not just complain about the realities I was seeing.
I know, and isn't that a delicate balance, right? You have to say how it really is and be honest, which sounds like such a bummer. Nobody likes to get bad news, but at the same time, it's really what's happening, and then try to come up with ways to make it more positive or just to look at possibilities.
Yeah, totally. Well, I wrote this, one of the series that I wrote that got a lot of attention that I eventually turned into a book is called Road Warrior Without an Expense Account. And it was a 10-part series, this kind of analyzing the music, the classical music, art music, the job prospects in that world. So again, similar along the lines of what you're talking about on this podcast, or what we're talking about. And chapter 9 or part 9 of the blog post series was called Refocusing Musical Entrepreneurship. And I started to dig into that concept in that book. This is 2008. I think I put this book out, and it's so exciting to look now and see finally that's something that's starting to be talked about in music school. People are I'm seeing websites springing up about that. And I love that because that's a more constructive way of looking at job prospects or employment prospects, rather than just complaining about the fact that, oh, it's hard to get gigs. There aren't any gigs. There aren't any orchestra jobs. It's all lies that we've been told. So that's a topic that I find really fascinating. And on my podcast right now, it's kind of a mix of talking to leaders in the world of double bass, and then also talking to people that are striking out and doing something a little more entrepreneurial. And those are kind of the two thrusts of my podcast and my blog, frankly, right now.
Well, it sounds like you're way ahead of the game with that book. I mean, 2008, and people are just kind of starting to get it, that they need to start talking about it now. So you're way ahead of the curve there.
I think I was ahead of the curve, and then I ended up taking a different job, and I just quit doing all of this stuff. So then I think I became behind the curve, and now hopefully I'm caught up to the curve or something like that.
So you did take a little break for a little while, and then
yeah, well, I went back to school right around when my wife went to med school. I went back to school actually for music education. Both my parents were teachers, and I just wanted a job. I just wanted a paycheck, and I wanted a salary, and I wanted some benefits, and I liked teaching, and I knew that there was the possibility of getting a job if I went back to school. And it was so fascinating I think I freelanced full time for 7 years, something like that. And it was so interesting going from that world, the world of classical music, and trying to get an orchestra job, and the sort of mentality of, if I cross every T and dot every I and work so insanely hard, harder than anybody, there's the possibility that someday I might possibly get a job, maybe. And it was so interesting to go from that world and that mindset to the music education world, where I kind of expressed that to a few people, and they looked at me like I was nuts. They said, what are you talking about? Of course you're going to get a job. Everybody gets a job. Our job placement's 100%. It's what kind of job do you want? And it was so refreshing, after so many years of worry and anxiety about all those kind of things that we musicians worry about, to just not worry about that for a change. And I did get a job, and then I got a better job after that, and a better one after that. And I loved working in the world of music ed. I had a blast. It was so much fun and so much more creative than I thought it was going to be. It was actually way more creative than the freelance world, which I found fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you leave the job then? Now are you currently employed?
I have left that world. And again, most of my major life decisions come as a result of conversations with my wife. My wife got a job in San Francisco. She's now doing a radiology residency. So the University of California, San Francisco brought her on. So she's in her second year of residency, and it's the top program in the country for residency. So it was kind of a no-brainer. The only area of concern for me was that it was not in Chicago, where I'd been living for 20 some years, but in San Francisco. So I knew that I was very concerned about leaving my network and the world that I had built up in Chicago. I had a very good orchestra director job. I was freelancing. I was teaching at DePaul University. I was one of the bass faculty there. And so I stayed for a year. We did long distance, and I got into that, and about 4 or 5 days into it, I realized this is madness. I'm living apart from my wife for essentially a high school teaching job. It's a good high school teaching job, but what am I doing? This is not a life decision that makes sense. So I knew that come what may, I was going to leave Chicago and leave that job. And that kind of got me thinking, what's the next step for me? And so I had to ask myself, is the next step more being a high school orchestra director? And I really loved that job for sure. But I look back at what I'd done in my life and what had really made the most impact, and what really felt right. And I realized that doing the podcast and doing the blog, people still, were coming up and talking to me about how much it meant to them. I had people who have some major symphony jobs talk to me and say, I listened to your podcast in high school and it was so influential in where I decided to go to school and what I decided to end up doing. And so I decided to experiment with restarting the podcast. And about October, so about a year ago, was when I got the idea to relaunch the podcast. I interviewed the new principal bass of the Chicago Symphony, Alex Hanna, and I cleaned things up. I gave things a fresh coat of paint and dusted off everything. And the numbers just went through the roof. People that had never found the podcast rediscovered it. And I logged in one day to my statistics and I thought there must be an error because all of a sudden thousands and thousands of people are downloading these every day. And it wasn't an error. It just, I passed 1 million downloads within a few months, and I'm coming up on 2 million downloads for the podcast. And so it really started to connect with people. And I realized where there's an audience like that, there's certainly a business that you can build around that. So I just decided to go all in on the podcast and not look for another education job and kind of go back to a freelance life. But what I'm thinking of as it's a term I'm stealing from Garrett Hope, who does a great podcast called The Portfolio Composer. I'm thinking of my life as more of a portfolio life right now. So I do the podcast. That's my focus, but I'm also teaching and I'm also playing gigs, but that's all kind of an offshoot of the podcast. I'm doing speaking engagements. I'm a clinician at different events. I'm writing more books and just I guess it is freelancing in a way, but I don't know if that's the right term for it. It's kind of like freelancing 2.0 maybe that I'm doing now.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. I mean, you really wrapped up that question amazingly for me to get an idea of how this podcast has impacted your career. And I want to ask you something that I ask on this show.
Sure.
I think now is a good time to ask it because it sounds like you might have had multiple of these. I ask about a thing which I call the fuck this moment.
Yes.
Where you have a moment in your adult life or career where you're at a crossroads and what you want for your life and also then with what you're doing in the other way, which is choose the safe route or you choose the unknown route. And it sounds like you've done that a few times. So I just wanted to know about what that fuck this moment was like.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think the moment was when I was driving home from a gig one night. I was driving home from the Northwest Indiana Symphony, and I will tell this story as briefly as I can. But I was driving home, and there was a big boom from under my car. And this is in the middle of my freelance career, right? This is like the height of being a freelancer. And this big boom happened and it sounded like I'd blown a hole in my muffler. So I'm driving down the freeway and I'm thinking, okay, I've got a hole in my muffler. That's not great, but whatever. I'll call my wife and she'll pick me up at the Saturn dealership. This is a Saturn. And my bass is in the car because I'm coming home from a gig. And all of a sudden I start to smell smoke. And I look behind me and my back seat is on fire. The back seat of my car is on fire. And I think, panic is what happens. And so I pull my car over by the side of the road and get out. And at that point, like the interior of the car is on fire. So I get my bass out of the flames. I grab a few things from my car. I start running down the freeway.
Oh my gosh.
And the car at that point is on fire. I call 911. I call my parents, my poor parents, who don't even live anywhere near me. And like, Mom, my car's on fire. And eventually the car explodes like the movies, not as dramatic as the movies, but the gas tank eventually goes and the car erupts in flames. And it was a Saturn, so it was a plastic exterior. So I watch, and the freeway, this particular freeway in Chicago, is headed north, is at an incline. So I watched this rivulet of molten plastic that was the exterior of my car go by my feet. And I'll tell you, that was the moment. That was my fuck this moment, because I'm coming back from a gig that I'm making $70
right.
from, I'm now standing by the side of the road, and then I had to go rent a car to go to the next day's the performance the next day. So I get down to Northwest Indiana in my rental car, and a bunch of people, they come up to me and they say, "I saw you, man. I saw you last night. I saw you by the side of the road. You were running away from your car. You had your base. And I thought, well, why didn't you stop and say it? You know, but who knows why they didn't stop? But that was definitely the moment where I thought, this is madness, this life I'm living. And so that is definitely the big moment, I think.
That, oh my gosh. I can't believe they didn't stop. You're like, what? You saw me? Hello?
Well, I'm not sure if I would stop. You know, I was covered in soot at that point because I'd been in the fire. I noticed that when I finally got my wife picked me up in her car, and there's like a ponytailed guy running down the freeway with a bass, covered in soot with a giant flaming car, you know, behind him. I can understand.
Right. And then you have to rent a car to go to the gig. So basically you made no money on that gig.
Right. And then you have to call your insurance company. And I was driving home and my car caught fire and exploded. And then I had all these public library audio cassette books. This dates when this happened, is about 10 years ago. And so I had to go to the Evanston Public Library and say, my car caught fire and exploded and all your tapes melted. So I had to pay them. And it just sort of struck home that I never loved the sort of driftless freelancer feeling. That was a big thing for me going back and doing the high school job. I really liked the feeling of being associated with an organization. And so I think that was like at my most driftless and hopeless. I'm like this wandering gypsy person with an exploding car, and I'm, you know, just twisting in the wind, driving to Northwest Indiana in my rental car. Yeah, that was a low point for me.
I see that. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's crazy. I could see how that could, yeah. So then at that point, was it shortly after that point where you said, this is not what I'm going to be focusing the bulk of my time on anymore? Or was that right before you decided to go back to school?
You know, I think that got the ball rolling. It still took me a little while. I think we musicians can be really conservative in our decision making a lot of the time, and even if even if pastures really are greener elsewhere, we're like in our groove that we've dug for ourselves, and we're just kind of chugging along. So no, it took me a little while, and I didn't even realize what I was doing. I knew I was going back to school, but what I didn't realize was that I had this whole period of transition, and and the podcast and the blog, I had really started to create some value, and people were starting to hire me for their projects. I was managing a couple other people's podcasts. I was getting some speaking gigs out of it, and I did have a moment where I thought, I'm either going to go into this or I'm going to go the education route. And, you know, I'm not, who knows, hindsight, whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing, but I just decided I had already put so much into this education degree. I felt like it was strange to just bail on that. So I thought, I'm just going to finish this and I'll do this. And I just wasn't ready to embrace the entrepreneurial lifestyle, I guess, for lack of a better word. But then going and living in that world, I did that for 7 years. So I freelanced for 7 years, did a very traditional job then for 7 years. And I sort of see the benefits of both. And so I've kind of gone back in a way to what I was doing at that point of change, but maybe with a little bit of a more informed opinion. So yeah, like very long answer to your short question, but it did get going not too long after that, but it really wasn't until 2015 that I really kind of figured out what I had been doing and where I could go with that in terms of my career.
Wow. Yeah. And it must have been so amazing to find out what kind of value you were bringing to people without even really realizing it. When people started to give you so much feedback, and when you relaunched the podcast and you started getting so many more downloads than you ever expected, that must have been a great feeling.
Yeah, it was a great feeling, and it's interesting doing your own thing. These are like the challenges of doing what you're doing or what I'm doing out there. The rewards are asynchronous with the effort put in my experience. So I feel like I'll sometimes feel like I am working so hard and just pouring my heart and soul into something, and I'm just seeing nothing in terms of results. And then I'm just kind of doing my own thing, or I'm on a walk, and all of a sudden I'll get what I call a true fan message. And I love true fan messages. Those are when I open up my email and I have like an 8-paragraph email from somebody about, I just got one recently. The guy delivers farm equipment in Pennsylvania and drives around, and he just listens to these podcasts, and he's talking about how meaningful he's found them in his life and so inspiring. And I just love hearing back from people like that. And I know for every one person that reaches out like that, there are another 10 that are probably it's affecting them a similar way, and they just haven't reached out yet. So yeah, it really is a special feeling. But it's interesting doing your own thing. Not the reward. I think it's similar in teaching or in many other things, but the rewards are definitely asynchronous with the effort you put in.
Right. It's not like when you perform and everyone stands up and starts clapping and you immediately know how they felt about what your performance was. But then at the same time, after that, it's over and you go home.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it's such a direct thing with the applause. Like, here, I just played Brahms 2. Now I'm done with Brahms 2. Now everyone's applauding. Now I can go home and take out my outfit and relax. It's just like a very clear thing, and it's a very social thing. And that's one of the challenges of podcasting and blogging and that sort of thing. In a way, it is very social. Like, we're having this conversation. A great deal of my week is spent having conversations like we're having and reaching out and spending time on Facebook. But it's just me sitting in my place doing this. It's so different than going to a rehearsal or going in directly an orchestra like I did. So that's a challenge with doing something online. Is you really spend a lot of time in your own head and in your own space and just this sort of isolated weirdo versus just playing in a bass section, playing in a horn section, playing in an orchestra. And I still do that. And I think I would really miss that if I quit doing that, because I mean, we're musicians. It's a social thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you still freelance a bit?
I do. And I love it. But I did all through when I had the teaching job, and I came to what I loved about taking the high school job is I eliminated all the freelancing that I didn't like. And I kept some of the really good gigs. And so every time I went to a gig, it was like a great experience because it was a high quality group and it was with people I really enjoyed. And for me, there's definitely a happy medium. If I don't play enough, I miss it. If I play too much, I start to remember why I got out of freelancing.
Oh, I totally hear you. I have the same experiences as well freelancing now too.
Yeah.
You know, I've kind of streamlined it down to I do the stuff that really means something to me so I can still love it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then I'm looking for other ways to enhance my life that have more meaning, because it's true. You have to at some point figure out what you're doing that brings you the most joy.
Yeah. And well, that's one thing I love about the podcast, because it's kind of a form of self-improvement for me, honestly. Like, I do it and people listen to it and I love that, but I would also love to be having these conversations even if there was no podcast associated with it. And so I like for me, I think the idea for my podcast is this is the sort of conversation I'd be having over a cup of coffee or a cocktail or something with somebody anyway. And the audience is just getting a chance to kind of eavesdrop on this conversation. And by really connecting with one person like that, like I do with my interviews and researching them and reading about them and talking about these different topics, I find that it's like getting a lesson kind of. So it's such a satisfying way to spend my time. And then I'm helping other people by doing it too. So it just feels like a really, like I said, starting off the podcast, it felt like a positive direction to be taking my life. And I feel that more now than ever.
That's amazing.
Uh,
And what I've experienced too I'm while I'm a total rookie compared to you, just having the ability to have conversations that, like you said, you would have them over a cocktail or a cup of coffee, but most of the people I'm talking to, like you live on the other side of the country, and I haven't talked to you in 15 plus years. And
right.
here I am having an awesome conversation with you. So that's what's so great about this is that you actually, I have the opportunity to have great conversations again. And think what you're telling me through contra-based conversations you've experienced.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, it's a great excuse to have a fun conversation with somebody that you'd want to connect with anyway, but maybe it's just hard to find time in any time, but especially in today's era to block out a half hour or an hour and talk with somebody. So it's great. I get to talk with all these people that I would kill to talk to anyway, and it's just a convenient framework to have the yeah.
Yeah. So Jason, I saw that you went recently to Prague. Was it for a bass convention?
Yeah, it was the fifth annual or biannual European Bass Congress. And it was so great to go. I love events like that. The only time I feel like a celebrity of sorts is when I go to an event like that and people hear my voice and they say, "That's Jason Heath. I recognize," and people come up and they look at my name tag and it's an easy way to get a big ego if you're not careful going to events like that. But I got so much out of it. It was so fun to connect with people and especially going over to Europe and talking to people that I've been wanting to talk to anyway for the podcast. I have probably 3 years worth of interviews that's scheduled just from that event. And boy, what a fun way to spend your life. Every single day I was there, I woke up and I got up and I walked outside and I looked around and I said, "I'm in Prague. A year ago, I was taking attendance and now I'm in Prague. I'm going to go get an espresso. I'm going to go hang out with these fascinating people from across the globe and life is good." So yeah, I was over there for a base, and that's my thing now, focusing on the podcast. I'm trying to go to those events and connect with people there, and it's a great way to grow the show. It's a great way to find guests. It's a great way to connect with the audience, and it's fun. Who wouldn't want to go to Prague?
That's what I'm thinking. I needed to ask that question because I want to go to Prague so bad, and I saw the picture on your Facebook page, and I'm like, this is just every background is so beautiful. It's like you wake up and you get to be there for work. It's so great.
Well, it's funny being in the States. I think the oldest thing, and San Francisco is not the youngest city in the U.S. at all, but the oldest thing here is maybe like 1850, right? So you go to Prague and you're looking at these buildings that are from 1100, 1200, and walking by them, you see the Moldau, and you're up in Prague Castle, and there's just so much. The place just oozes history, and as a classical musician, boy, spending time in Europe just bring it just, you connect so much more strongly with this music that we all play, thinking about the people that walking those same streets that were composed, like Dvorak and Smetana, and yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I really hope I get to go there soon because it's so gorgeous, so neat.
Yeah.
It's fun that you get to feel like a celebrity.
Well, it's fun. It's cool being in Prague because Prague, it actually has a few similarities to San Francisco. Not a ton. It's not on the ocean, but there's this big, steep mountain, right? Or I call it a mountain, very tall hill that Prague Castle sits on. And I had an Airbnb kind of at the base of that mountain. And I went out and it reminds me of Buena Vista Park here in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. And I'm just scaling this mountain and I'm just like thinking about my daily walks that I have in San Francisco. Such a gorgeous place. Yeah. Can't wait to go back.
Awesome. That's so cool. So do you have any really interesting people coming up on your show that you want to mention?
There's interesting to us bass geeks, and then there's interesting to the wider music world. So let me think of who would be. Well, I just yesterday interviewed Dave Swift, who is in Jules Holland's band. Now that might not mean much to people in the U.S., but Jules Holland's show is kind of like it's a music show, but it kind of think of like the Tonight Show or something like that. They play with, you name it. He's played with Shaka Khan, Akira, Adele. He was just telling me a story about how he was playing for Smokey Robinson and they needed to recruit a guitar player. So they recruited Eric Clapton to play guitar. And this amazing story. He's played with Paul McCartney. In fact, he's played with the three of the four Beatles, all of them except John Lennon. And boy, it's so fun to connect with somebody like Dave. We talked for an hour and a half. We probably could have talked for 4 more hours. So yeah, Dave's coming up. He was a blast to talk with. And actually, for people that listen to your show, I have a whole week coming up. I don't know what I'm going to call it, but it's like non-bass, this is a terrible name, so I won't call it this, but it's like non-basis on contrabass conversations. I interviewed Seth Haynes, who's just written a book called Break Into the Scene. He has a website called The Musician's Guide to Hustling. So I think folks that are listening to your show would like to check out Seth's interview. Definitely Dave Swift would be a great one to listen to. I interviewed one of the cello teachers at Rice, Corky Watkins, who wrote a book called Rosin Dust. And Corky has this really fascinating lens into the world of teaching. So she and I just geeked out on teaching and how she trains people to be better studio teachers. And I'm trying to hit some tangential topics that I think would be interesting to my audience, but that aren't just bass player profiles. So yeah, Seth's episode, Dave's episode, Corky's episode, anything in October, check it out.
I'm very interested. Okay, I'm glad I asked you that because I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. Yeah. Awesome. So, Jason, I have a couple final questions I want to ask you to wrap it up here.
Sure.
And the first one is, do you have one habit or behavior that you've developed over the years that has made the most difference in your career so far?
Yeah, I think I've developed. Yeah, boy, how do I summarize this? A skill. This is a very hard skill to develop, and I think I've developed the skill at being able to look at something from a lot of different angles. This might be a horrible answer to this question, but like I've gotten as I look at my career and how it's unfolded, and especially the things online, I found that I kind of hit upon solutions to problems that people haven't really thought of yet. And I'm even doing that with my podcast. Like I created this series called Winning the Audition, where I synthesized all these audition experiences from all these guests I've had and kind of created a how-to for people for taking auditions. And I've done a lot of projects like that in my life. And I think it's like this, the skill of being able to take something and let it kind of marinate and then look at it from a different way. And I think for me, it's all about running and working out, but more specifically running. So I think a habit I have is working, and I'd encourage anybody who's trying to do something in the creative arts or trying to come up with the sort of thing like I'm doing. I work for maybe 2-3 hours in the morning, and then I go for a 30-45 minute run. And I find that run kind of synthesizes all these different ideas I've had. And I a lot of time I'll run and then I'll rush home and I'll write down like 2 or 3 paragraphs of some idea to like combine ideas into something new. I think it's a Steve Jobs quote, but like all inventing is really just taking things that already exist and combining them in unfamiliar ways. And I think that's a skill I've been able to develop in my career. And I think that the actual moment when I come up with these ideas is when I'm running. So I guess, again, very long answer to your short question, running.
Well, Well, I can relate to that because sometimes I'll be practicing and I practice the same routine once a day that is just, it gets me through all the technical stuff that keeps me in shape. So, and I find that I can do that while I think, and sometimes it's just the act of doing an activity that doesn't require a lot of brain work because it's a physical activity that allows your brain to go to another place. And that's sort of what sounds like you're describing that the run does for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like changing your physical state, like your physical state and your mental state are tied together so much more than you may think or we may want to think. But really, just getting out and changing your physical state changes how your brain's working. I mean, it's that simple. And I find that doing that, breaking up, and for me, working for a few hours and then doing that is more powerful than just doing that. I know a lot of people like to start their day with working out or with practicing or whatever, but I like working on my projects, my writing, my podcasting, the winning the audition kind of ideas, and then getting out and running. And it's like I get a breath of fresh air by doing that.
And you just stop what you're doing and you go change your physical, what you were doing physically and go switch it up and then come back and you're fresh. I love that. I think I actually want to try that. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
So my last question for you is, who in the classical world inspires you, and tell me why in one sentence.
Sure. I'd say Hugh Sung. Right now, Hugh is, okay, I'll keep it to one sentence. I'm very lengthy in my answers. So, Hugh captures Hugh is imaginative, both in music and business, in a way that I aspire to be. That's a sentence. So Hugh is he teaches at Curtis, but he also invented the air turn, the Bluetooth foot pedal that people use. And now he started his own podcast, A Musical Life. He's got this mastermind, A Musical Life mastermind. And I find his energy and he's always coming up with new ideas. He's such a positive guy. I just find him a really inspiring figure in the world of classical music right now. If you're not familiar with Hugh, check him out. He'll make you laugh. He'll make you think. And he's just got such a positive energy. I really appreciate what he does.
Awesome. I am definitely going to check him out. I did notice he has a podcast, but I really don't know much about him. So I'm definitely going to check that out. Thank you for bringing him up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jason, thank you so much. Oh, I don't want to cut you off.
No, and I would just say he would be a wonderful guest for your podcast too. I think that you two would hit it off so well and just have a fascinating conversation. So I'd love to hear him on your show. Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, that is such a great idea. Okay, I'm going to check him out too. Jason, this has been a wealth of knowledge. This has been just a golden filled interview for me, at least. I'm so excited to bring it to my audience and have them hear it. So thank you so much for taking time to be here with me today on the show. And thank you everyone for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.